The arrival of Grace. The Michelin-starred restaurant, Le Toile d'Or, was the crowning jewel of culinary excellence in the heart of the city. Its luxurious decor, resplendent with golden chandeliers and marble floors, dazzled an elite clientele who spoke in hushed tones, savoring delicacies served on the finest china. Beyond the dining room's opulent facade, however, was a world that pulsed with tension, a high-stakes kitchen where the flame of ambition burned hot, and the shadow of fear loomed large. At the heart of this kitchen empire was Chef Adrien Dumont, a man of brilliance and cruelty in equal measure. His towering figure, precise movements, and commanding voice made him the undisputed leader of his realm. But beneath the crisp chef whites and accolades lay a man whose volatile temper and unrelenting perfectionism often reduced his staff to nervous wrecks. Over time, the kitchen had become a place of dread rather than inspiration. For all his fame, Adrien was blind to the quiet rot festering under his leadership, a rot that had begun to eat away at his staff's morale. Talented cooks, dishwashers, and waitstaff came and went, their spirits broken, while Adrien's reputation as a tyrant grew in tandem with his culinary success. But change was coming, though Adrien didn't yet know it. It arrived one crisp morning in the form of Grace Harper, a petite, unassuming woman with silver-streaked hair neatly tucked under a knitted cap. Dressed in modest slacks and a well-ironed blouse, she walked through the restaurant's ornate entrance, her kind eyes scanning the room with quiet interest. She was here to apply for the role of dishwasher, a position far beneath her age and bearing, but one she pursued with determination. The maitre d', a young man named Louis, looked up from his clipboard as Grace approached. "Madam, are you lost?" he asked politely, his brow furrowing slightly. "We're not open yet." Grace smiled warmly. "Not lost, dear. I'm here about the dishwasher position. I was told to arrive for the morning shift." Louis blinked, visibly taken aback. "The dishwasher position?" "Yes." Grace's tone was light but firm. "I believe Chef Dumont is expecting me." Louis hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Finally, he nodded and gestured for her to follow. "This way, please." As they walked through the labyrinth of gleaming hallways and into the heart of the kitchen, Grace took in her surroundings, the clang of pots and pans, the hurried footsteps of the prep cooks, and the faint aroma of simmering stock. She caught glimpses of nervous glances exchanged between staff as they scrambled to ready themselves before Chef Dumont's arrival. "Wait here," Louis instructed, before disappearing behind the double doors leading to the chef's office. Grace waited, hands clasped loosely in front of her, listening to the controlled chaos around her. A young line cook nearby whispered to another, "Why'd they hire her? She's too old for this." The other shrugged. "Not our business. But Dumont won't let her last the day." Moments later, the doors burst open, and Chef Adrien strode into the room. His presence alone seemed to shift the energy in the kitchen. Conversation ceased, and everyone straightened as if preparing for inspection. Adrien's piercing gaze landed on Grace, his expression unreadable at first. "You're here for the dishwasher position." His deep voice carried an edge of incredulity. "I am," Grace replied evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Adrien's eyes narrowed slightly as he took her measure. "You do realize this isn't a charity position. We don't hire people just to make them feel useful. This is a serious job, and I expect excellence. Do you think you can manage that?" Grace's smile didn't waver. "I assure you, Chef, I'm more than capable." "Good." He gestured toward the dishwashing station. "Prove it. Get started." Without hesitation, Grace moved to the sink and rolled up her sleeves. She tied an apron around her waist and began her work with practiced efficiency. Adrien lingered for a moment, watching her, but when she gave no sign of being overwhelmed or intimidated, he turned his attention elsewhere. Throughout the morning, Grace quietly observed the kitchen's dynamics as she scrubbed, rinsed, and dried. Adrien moved like a general commanding his troops, his sharp commands punctuated by bursts of frustration. "This sauce is an insult to gastronomy," he shouted at one cook, who paled visibly. "Do it again, or find another job." Grace's heart ached as she watched a sous chef freeze under Adrian's cutting words, her hands trembling as she attempted to salvage a dish. Nearby, a prep cook whispered an apology to a waitress after dropping a tray of utensils, their cheeks flushed with shame. By lunchtime, it was clear to Grace that the rumors she'd heard were true. The staff worked under constant fear, their creativity stifled by the oppressive atmosphere. Yet, amidst the chaos, she also saw glimpses of resilience, staff members covering for each other's mistakes, offering whispered words of encouragement when Adrian wasn't looking. As the day wore on, Grace's presence didn't go unnoticed. Despite her quiet demeanor, she exuded a calm authority that seemed to settle those around her. Staff began to approach her, offering brief smiles or small words of thanks when she returned their clean dishes. It was as though her very presence acted as a counterbalance to Adrian's domineering energy. By the end of her first shift, Grace's hands were red and pruned from hours of scrubbing, but she felt a quiet satisfaction. She had entered this world under the guise of a dishwasher, but her true mission was just beginning. Somewhere deep within, she knew that her arrival at Uli Toildor would set into motion a chain of events that would challenge Adrian Dumont's iron rule and bring hope back to those who had long since given up. As she left the kitchen that evening, she passed by a weary line cook who muttered under his breath, "She's got guts, I'll give her that." Grace smiled to herself. Guts were only the beginning. The stage was set. The first move had been made. Cracks beneath the surface. Grace arrived early the next morning, the faint light of dawn filtering through the city streets. The grand facade of Uli Toildor gleamed under the streetlights, a silent testament to its reputation. Yet, the warmth and splendor it promised to its patrons masked the cold reality of the kitchen behind the scenes. Inside, the kitchen was already alive with activity. Prep cooks diced vegetables with mechanical precision, line chefs reviewed recipes, and servers set tables in the dining room beyond. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh herbs, simmering stocks, and rising tension. Always the tension. Grace tied on her apron, her expression calm but observant. As she resumed her post at the dishwashing station, she noticed the line cooks' trained faces, their movements rushed and jittery. The staff's nervous energy seemed heightened today, likely in anticipation of another long day under Chef Adrian's exacting eye. It didn't take long for Adrian to storm into the kitchen, his presence commanding immediate silence. He barked orders, inspected prep work with a sharp eye, and scowled at even the slightest imperfection. His anger seemed amplified, his words slicing through the staff like knives. "This is unacceptable," Adrian shouted, holding up a plate of freshly julienned carrots. "Do you call this consistent? I've seen toddlers with better knife skills." The young prep cook responsible flinched, his cheeks burning as he stammered an apology. Adrian rolled his eyes. "Don't waste my time with apologies. Fix it. Now." Grace observed the scene quietly, her hands steady as she rinsed and stacked dishes. She noticed how the young cook's hands trembled as he redid the task, his focus shattered. Across the kitchen, others exchanged furtive glances, the unspoken fear palpable in the air. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, Grace also noticed subtle acts of kindness. A sous chef discreetly slid a perfectly sliced carrot to the prep cook, a small gesture to help him avoid another tirade. A server passing through offered a quick pat on the back to a trembling line cook. These small moments of solidarity gave Grace hope, even as they highlighted the toxic culture Adrian had cultivated. By midday, the tension had reached a boiling point. Adrian's criticisms grew sharper, his temper flaring at even minor mistakes. He berated a server for delivering an order too slowly, chastised a pastry chef for the mediocrity of her crème brûlée, and even snapped at Louis, the maitre d', for the way the napkins were folded. Grace remained calm through it all, her presence steady and unyielding. She had seen leaders like Adrian before, brilliant but blinded by their own egos, unable to see the damage they inflicted. She knew that confronting such a man required patience and strategy. As the day wore on, Grace noticed something unusual. Adrian seemed particularly intent on provoking her. He made snide comments about her age, questioned her competence, and went out of his way to criticize her work. "You missed a spot, Grandma," he sneered as he inspected a plate she had just polished. "Do you even know what spotless means?" Grace met his gaze evenly. "I do, Chef. And I believe you'll find that plate is spotless." Adrian's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. Instead, he turned away, barking orders at the staff with renewed vigor. Grace's calm demeanor seemed to unsettle him, as if her refusal to react to his provocations challenged his authority in some unspoken way. By evening, the tension in the kitchen was almost unbearable. A high-profile guest, a prominent food critic, was dining at the restaurant, and Adrian's obsessive pursuit of perfection had reached new heights. He micromanaged every aspect of the service, his sharp tongue leaving a trail of bruised egos in its wake. "Faster," he shouted at the line cooks. "Do you want the food to arrive cold? Move, or I'll find someone who can." The staff worked feverishly, their movements frantic as they tried to meet Adrian's impossible standards. Grace watched from her station, her heart heavy. She could see the exhaustion in their faces, the way their hands shook with fatigue and fear. It was a cruel cycle. Adrian demanded perfection, and his methods ensured they could never achieve it. As the night wore on, a moment of crisis unfolded. One of the servers, a young woman named Clara, accidentally spilled a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The delicate canapes landed on the pristine floor, a small disaster in the world of fine dining. Adrian's face turned crimson as he stormed toward Clara. "Are you completely incompetent?" he bellowed. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you think our guests came here to watch you fumble around like an amateur?" Clara's eyes filled with tears as she stammered an apology. "I'm so sorry, Chef. It was an accident. I don't care about your excuses." Adrian interrupted, his voice rising. "Get out of my sight. Now." The entire kitchen froze, the staff holding their breath as they watched Clara flee, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Adrian turned to the rest of the staff, his expression furious. "Let this be a lesson to all of you. I will not tolerate incompetence in my kitchen. Do I make myself clear?" A murmured chorus of "Yes, Chef" followed, but the tension in the room was thicker than ever. Grace, however, had had enough. She set down her dishcloth and stepped forward, her calm presence drawing the attention of the entire kitchen. "Chef Adrian," she said, her voice steady but firm. "If I may." Adrian turned to her, his expression a mix of surprise and irritation. "What do you want, Grace? This is hardly the time for a lecture." "I understand the pressure we're all under," Grace said, meeting his gaze. "But humiliating your staff won't improve the service. If anything, it will only make things worse." The room fell silent, the staff holding their breath as they watched the exchange. Adrian's eyes narrowed, his pride clearly wounded. "And what would you know about running a kitchen, Grace? You're a dishwasher. Stay in your lane." Grace's expression didn't waver. "I know enough to see that fear isn't an effective motivator. Respect is. Perhaps it's time to reconsider your approach." For a moment, Adrian looked as if he might explode. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists. But then, to everyone's surprise, he turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. As the kitchen slowly returned to its rhythm, Grace resumed her work, her mind already racing with the next steps of her plan. The cracks in Adrian's facade were beginning to show, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the entire structure came tumbling down. In the quiet moments that followed, Sarah, one of the waitresses, approached Grace. "That was brave," she whispered. "But be careful. He doesn't take well to being challenged." Grace smiled softly. "Don't worry about me, dear. I've faced worse storms than this." She turned back to her work, her resolve unwavering. Change was coming to L'Etoile. It wouldn't be easy, but Grace was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The seed of change. The next morning, Grace arrived at L'Etoile with a quiet determination. The events of the previous evening had shaken the kitchen staff to their core. Clara, the young server who had borne the brunt of Adrian's fury, had tendered her resignation overnight. The atmosphere in the restaurant was a mix of resentment, exhaustion, and uneasy anticipation. As Grace stepped into the kitchen, she noticed how the staff avoided making eye contact with Adrian, their movements hesitant and tense. Adrian, for his part, seemed more irritable than usual, snapping at even the smallest mistakes. Yet beneath his bluster, Grace detected a flicker of something else. Uncertainty. Her words the night before had struck a nerve, though Adrian would never admit it. Grace tied on her apron and began her work, her presence as calm and steady as ever. As she scrubbed dishes, she quietly observed the staff's interactions, noting the small acts of kindness and solidarity that persisted despite the oppressive atmosphere. A sous chef whispered words of encouragement to a nervous prep cook. A line chef subtly corrected a plating mistake for a junior team member before Adrian could notice. These moments of humanity gave Grace hope. By mid-morning, the kitchen was in full swing, preparing for a lunch service that included several high-profile guests. The pressure was palpable, but Grace noticed something unusual. Adrian seemed more subdued. His criticisms were still sharp, but his voice lacked the usual venom. It was as if her words had left him questioning himself, though he would never admit it. As Grace worked, Sarah, the waitress who had become one of her quiet allies, approached her at the dishwashing station. "Grace," Sarah whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "Clara called me last night. She said she couldn't take it anymore. She's leaving town to find work somewhere else." Grace sighed, her heart heavy. "I'm not surprised. This isn't the first time someone's been driven out, and it won't be the last unless something changes." Sarah hesitated, then leaned in closer. "Some of us have been talking. We're thinking of going to Marcus, the owner, and telling him what's been happening. Maybe he doesn't know how bad things have gotten." Grace looked at Sarah thoughtfully. "Marcus is a good man, and he cares about this place. But he's also trusting Adrian to run things. If you go to him without concrete evidence, it might not achieve the result you're hoping for." Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace smiled gently. "Sometimes, it's not enough to tell people the truth. You have to show them, and that's what I intend to do." Sarah looked at her curiously, but before she could ask more, Adrian's voice rang out across the kitchen. "Sarah, stop gossiping and get back to work," he barked, his sharp tone cutting through the air. Sarah flinched but gave Grace a quick nod before hurrying off. Grace returned to her task, her mind racing. She knew the staff's patience was wearing thin, and if something didn't change soon, more would leave. But Grace also knew that change wouldn't come from rebellion alone. It required strategy and timing. That afternoon, an unexpected opportunity presented itself. A catering order for a prestigious corporate event had come in, and the entire kitchen was mobilized to prepare the elaborate menu. The event was being held in a nearby venue, requiring the food to be transported and served off-site, a logistical challenge that heightened the usual pressure. As the staff packed the carefully prepared dishes into insulated containers, Adrian grew increasingly agitated. "Make sure everything is perfect," he barked. "If even one plate is less than flawless, it's your head on the chopping block." Grace, observing from her station, noticed the tension in the room reach a fever pitch. The staff worked with frantic precision, double-checking every detail to avoid Adrian's wrath. Yet, despite their best efforts, mistakes were inevitable. When the team arrived at the venue, disaster struck. One of the containers had been improperly sealed, and a tray of hors d'oeuvres had shifted during transit, leaving the meticulously arranged canapés in disarray. The moment Adrian saw the damage, he exploded. "This is unacceptable," he shouted, his face turning red. "Who packed this container? Who's responsible for this mess?" The staff froze, no one daring to speak. Adrian's gaze swept the room, landing on a young line cook who was visibly trembling. "You," he barked. "Was this your doing?" The line cook stammered. I checked the seal, chef. I thought." "You thought?" Adrian interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's your problem. You don't think. You follow instructions. Do you have any idea what this means for our reputation?" As Adrian continued his tirade, Grace stepped forward, her calm voice cutting through the chaos. "Chef Adrian, may I suggest a solution?" Adrian turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "And what would you know about fixing this?" Grace met his gaze steadily. "I know that standing here yelling won't undo the damage. But if we work quickly, we can salvage the presentation. These canapés are still edible. And with a little creativity, we can make them look intentional." Adrian stared at her, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out at her, but then, perhaps realizing the practicality of her suggestion, he gave a curt nod. "Fine, do it. But if this fails, it's on you." Grace nodded and turned to the staff. "Let's get to work, everyone. We don't have much time." Under Grace's calm direction, the team sprang into action. She guided them with gentle authority, suggesting ways to rearrange the canapés and add garnishes to disguise the damage. Her steady presence seemed to reassure the staff, and for the first time, they worked without the constant fear of Adrian's criticism. By the time the guests arrived, the canapés had been transformed into an eye-catching display that drew compliments from the attendees. Adrian, though reluctant to acknowledge it, knew that Grace's quick thinking had saved the day. Back in the kitchen that evening, the staff buzzed with quiet gratitude for Grace. Her calm leadership during the crisis had shown them a glimpse of what the kitchen could be, a place of collaboration and creativity, rather than fear and intimidation. Adrian, however, seemed more conflicted than ever. His usual confidence was shaken, and he avoided making eye contact with Grace. Her words from the night before still echoed in his mind, challenging the foundations of his leadership style. As the kitchen wound down for the night, Sarah approached Grace again. "You really turned things around today," she said softly. "I don't think we could have done it without you." Grace smiled, her expression warm but thoughtful. "You all had it in you. You just needed someone to remind you." Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you think Adrian will ever change?" Grace's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of quiet resolve. "Change is never easy, especially for someone like Adrian, but I believe it's possible. The question is whether he's willing to face the truth about himself." As Grace finished her shift and left the kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that the winds of change were beginning to blow through Le Toildor. The cracks in Adrian's facade were growing, and it was only a matter of time before they gave way completely. Grace knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. The seed of change had been planted, and now it was time to nurture it, one small act of courage at a time. The turning point. The next day, the Le Toildor was busier than ever, the phone ringing incessantly with reservations and catering requests. The restaurant's reputation continued to draw high-profile clients, and while the dining room basked in luxury, the kitchen remained a cauldron of chaos. For the staff, it was just another day of keeping their heads down and surviving the torrent of demands and criticism from Chef Adrian. Grace arrived early as usual, her demeanor as serene as ever. The moment she entered the kitchen, she could sense that something was different. Whispers circulated among the staff, and nervous glances flickered toward the schedule board, where a catering order for a prestigious gala had been added overnight. The event would host some of the city's most influential figures, including journalists and food critics. The pressure to deliver perfection was suffocating. Adrian's mood was unusually intense. His sharp blue eyes darted around the kitchen, scrutinizing every detail. His voice, already notorious for its cutting edge, was harsher than ever. Yet Grace noticed something else, a flicker of hesitation in his movements, a brief pause before each outburst. It was subtle, but it was there. As the kitchen staff prepped for the day, Sarah approached Grace at the dishwashing station. Her brow was furrowed with concern. "Grace," she said in a low voice, "something's off. Adrian's worse than usual, but he seems distracted." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "The pressure's getting to him. He knows he's losing his grip, even if he won't admit it." Sarah bit her lip. "Do you think we should do something? Say something, before it gets worse?" Grace placed a comforting hand on Sarah's arm. "Change is already in motion, dear. Sometimes you have to let the storm run its course before the skies clear." The first signs of resistance. The lunch rush brought its usual chaos. Orders flooded in, and the staff scrambled to keep up. Adrian was relentless, barking commands and nitpicking every plate. Yet the tension in the air was thicker than usual, and Grace could sense that the staff's patience was wearing thin. It started with a small mistake. A young line cook accidentally overcooked a steak, and when Adrian discovered it, his fury was immediate. "Do you think this is some backyard barbecue?" he shouted, holding the ruined steak aloft. "This is Uli Toil Dur. We serve perfection, not mediocrity." The line cook, a quiet man named Lubis, flushed with embarrassment. "I'll redo it, chef," he stammered. "You'll redo it?" Adrian sneered. "That's your solution? Wasting another cut of premium beef because you can't follow basic instructions?" Louis looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Adrian's words. The rest of the staff worked silently, pretending not to notice. But Grace noticed. She saw the anger simmering beneath their downcast gazes, the resentment building like steam in a pressure cooker. Later that afternoon, as Grace dried a tray of polished plates, she overheard a hushed conversation between two line cooks. "I can't take much more of this," one whispered. "He acts like we're robots, not people." "I know," the other replied. "But what can we do? If we stand up to him, we're out of a job." Grace's heart ached for them, but she also felt a spark of hope. The staff was beginning to question the status quo. They were beginning to see that Adrian's leadership was not infallible. The gala challenge. By early evening, the kitchen was a flurry of activity as preparations for the gala reached their peak. Adrian prowled the room like a hawk, his voice cutting through the air as he issued commands. "Check that sauce again," he barked at a sous chef. "I want it reduced perfectly, or it's going in the bin. Where's the garnish for the hors d'oeuvres?" he demanded of another. "Do you think our guests want bland, naked plates?" The staff moved with frantic precision, their nerves frayed by the constant barrage of criticism. Grace worked quietly at her station, her hands steady as she scrubbed and polished. She could feel the tension in the room building, the unspoken frustration bubbling beneath the surface. As the team loaded the catering van with the carefully prepared dishes, Adrian gave them one final warning. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Tonight is not just another event. It's the gala. Every guest is a critic, and every plate is a review. If anything goes wrong, it's on your heads. Do I make myself clear?" A murmured "yes" chef followed, but the staff's silence spoke volumes. They were exhausted, both physically and emotionally, and Grace knew that something had to give. A moment of defiance. At the gala venue, the staff worked tirelessly to set up the serving stations and ensure every dish was perfect. Adrian's presence loomed over them, his sharp eyes catching even the smallest imperfections. But as the first guests began to arrive, the unthinkable happened. A server accidentally dropped a tray of appetizers, the delicate canapés scattering across the pristine floor. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Adrian. His face turned red, and he opened his mouth to unleash his wrath. But before he could speak, something remarkable occurred. Louis, the quiet line cook who had endured Adrian's earlier tirade, stepped forward. "It was an accident, chef," he said, his voice firm. "We'll fix it," but yelling won't help. The room seemed to freeze. Adrian stared at Louis, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. The other staff members held their breath, waiting for the explosion. But before Adrian could respond, Grace stepped forward. "He's right, chef," she said calmly. "Accidents happen. What matters is how we handle them. Let's focus on finding a solution." Adrian glared at her, his fists clenched. "This is my kitchen," he hissed. "You don't tell me how to handle my staff." Grace met his gaze without flinching. "This isn't just your kitchen, Adrian. It belongs to everyone who works here. And if you want it to succeed, you need to start treating them like they matter." For a moment, Adrian looked as if he might lash out. But then, something shifted. The weight of Grace's words seemed to sink in, and he took a step back, his expression uncertain. "Fine," he muttered. "Fix it. Quickly." The staff sprang into action, cleaning up the mess and preparing fresh appetizers. The tension in the room remained, but Grace could feel the tide beginning to turn. The staff had stood up to Adrian, and for the first time, he had backed down. The ripple effect. When the team returned to the kitchen later that night, the atmosphere was electric. The staff exchanged quiet smiles and murmurs of encouragement, their spirits buoyed by the small victory. Adrian, however, retreated to his office without a word, his usual bluster replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. As Grace cleaned up her station, Sarah approached her with a look of awe. "You were amazing tonight," she said. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that." Grace smiled softly. "It wasn't just me. Louis showed incredible courage. Sometimes, all it takes is one voice to inspire others." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "You've given us hope, Grace. Maybe things really can change." Grace placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "They will, dear. But change takes time, and it takes all of us working together." As the kitchen lights dimmed and the staff prepared to leave, Grace felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The cracks in Adrian's facade were widening, and the seeds of change were beginning to take root. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but Grace knew they were moving in the right direction. The turning point had arrived, and there was no going back. Breaking point. The morning after the gala, the kitchen of Heartwarming buzzed with a mix of unease and cautious optimism. The staffs, still riding the wave of their small but significant victory from the night before, worked with a renewed sense of camaraderie. Yet the shadow of Chef Adrian loomed heavy. Everyone knew the storm wasn't over. It was merely gathering strength. Grace arrived early, as always, her calm demeanor masking the anticipation brewing beneath. The events of the previous night had been a turning point, but she knew the real test was yet to come. Adrian wasn't the kind of man to let his authority be challenged without retaliation. As she tied on her apron and began her tasks, she noticed the kitchen staff exchanging glances, their usual fear tempered by a spark of defiance. Louis, the line cook who had stood up to Adrian, moved with a newfound confidence, his shoulders squared as he prepared ingredients. Sarah, the waitress who had become Grace's ally, wore a quiet but determined expression. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. Adrian's arrival was imminent, and no one knew how he would react. The calm before the storm. Adrian entered the kitchen mid-morning, his presence as commanding as ever. His sharp eyes swept the room, taking in the staff's movements with an intensity that made even the most seasoned employees falter. But today there was something different about him. His usual fiery temper seemed restrained, his words clipped but measured. "Louis," he barked, pointing to a stack of pans. "I need those cleaned and ready within the hour, and don't waste time." Louis nodded, his voice steady. "Yes, chef." Adrian's gaze lingered on Louis for a moment longer than necessary, as if searching for a hint of defiance. When none came, he moved on, issuing orders with his usual precision. But Grace noticed the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his hands twitched slightly as he gestured. He was rattled. As the morning wore on, the kitchen settled into its rhythm. The staff worked efficiently, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Grace watched as they subtly supported one another, covering for mistakes and sharing tasks without Adrian noticing. The sense of unity was growing, and it was clear that Adrian's iron grip on the kitchen was beginning to slip. A dangerous confrontation. By lunchtime, the restaurant was packed, the dining room buzzing with activity. The kitchen hummed with controlled chaos as plates were prepared and sent out with precision. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension simmered. The breaking point came when Adrian spotted a mistake on one of the plates being sent to the pass. A garnish had been misplaced, and to Adrian, it was nothing short of a catastrophe. "Who plated this?" he demanded, his voice rising above the clatter of the kitchen. The line cook responsible stepped forward, his face pale. "I did, chef." "I? You what?" Adrian interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Decided to take creative liberties. Do you think this is some art class where you can do whatever you want?" The line cook stammered. "It was an accident, chef. I'll fix it." "An accident?" Adrian's face turned red with anger. "We don't have room for accidents here. If you can't handle the pressure, maybe you should find another job." The line cook's hands trembled as he began to replate the dish, but Adrian wasn't finished. He leaned in closer, his voice low and menacing. "You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot." Grace, who had been observing from her station, decided it was time to act. She set down her dishcloth and stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Chef Adrian," she said, drawing the attention of the entire kitchen. "May I have a word?" Adrian turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Not now, Grace. I'm busy." "It's important," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "And it can't wait." The staff froze, their eyes darting between Adrian and Grace. The tension in the room was suffocating, but Grace stood her ground, her expression unyielding. Adrian sighed heavily, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Fine," he said, gesturing toward his office. "Let's talk." The office showdown. In the privacy of Adrian's office, the atmosphere was charged. Adrian leaned against his desk, his arms crossed, while Grace stood before him, her posture straight and her gaze steady. "What is it, Grace?" Adrian asked, his voice laced with irritation. "If this is about last night, I don't want to hear it." "It's not just about last night," Grace replied. "It's about the way you run this kitchen, the way you treat your staff." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Grace said, her voice unwavering. "This kitchen operates under a culture of fear. Your staff works tirelessly, but instead of encouraging them, you berate them. You crush their spirits. And for what? To satisfy your ego." Adrian's jaw tightened. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under, the expectations, the standards I have to uphold." "I understand more than you think," Grace countered. "I've seen great chefs rise to the top and fall just as quickly. Do you know what makes the difference? Leadership, true leadership. A great chef inspires their team. They don't rule through intimidation." Adrian stared at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed he might lash out. But then his shoulders slumped, and he let out a heavy sigh. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice quieter now. "Every dish, every review, it's all a reflection of me. If something goes wrong, it's my reputation on the line." Grace softened her tone. "I understand the weight of responsibility, Adrian, but you're not carrying it alone. You have a team, a talented, dedicated team that wants to succeed. But they need your support, not your criticism." Adrian looked away, his jaw clenched. For the first time, Grace saw a crack in his armor, a glimpse of vulnerability he rarely showed. "What if it's too late?" he murmured. "What if I've already done too much damage?" "It's never too late to change," Grace said gently. "But change starts with you. If you're willing to admit your mistakes and take responsibility. Your team will follow. They want to respect you, Adrian, but you have to earn it." Adrian was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he finally looked up, there was a flicker of resolve in his eyes. "What do I need to do?" he asked. "The plan." Grace smiled, a spark of hope igniting in her chest. "First, you need to apologize to the entire staff. A genuine apology, not just for last night, but for everything." Adrian nodded slowly. "And after that?" "After that, you start listening," Grace said. "Really listening. Your team has ideas, concerns, and talents that you've ignored for too long. Give them a voice. Show them that their opinions matter." Adrian took a deep breath, his expression a mix of apprehension and determination. "It won't be easy." "Nothing worthwhile ever is," Grace replied. As they left the office and returned to the kitchen, Grace felt a sense of cautious optimism. Adrian had taken the first step, but the road ahead would be long and challenging. The breaking point had been reached, and now it was time to rebuild. The staff watched in stunned silence as Adrian called for their attention. His usual commanding presence was tempered with an unfamiliar humility. "I owe you all an apology," he began, his voice steady but strained. "I've let my pride and my temper get the better of me. I've pushed you too hard, and I haven't given you the respect you deserve. That changes now." The room remained silent, the staff exchanging uncertain glances. But as Adrian continued, his words genuine and heartfelt, Grace saw the walls begin to crumble. The staff's guarded expressions softened, and for the first time in years, hope filled the air. Change had begun, and Grace knew that, with time and effort, L'Etoile could become the place it was always meant to be, a kitchen built not on fear, but on trust, respect, and collaboration. A new legacy. The transformation at L'Etoile didn't happen overnight, but it began that very evening with Chef Adrian's heartfelt apology. The kitchen staff, who had spent years enduring his tirades, were stunned into silence as he stood before them, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I've failed you," Adrian began, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I let my pride blind me, and I made this kitchen a place of fear instead of inspiration. I see now that the way I've treated all of you, my team, was wrong. No amount of Michelin stars can justify the harm I've caused. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you'll allow me the chance to make things right." The staff exchanged wary glances, their skepticism evident, but Grace could see the flicker of hope in their eyes, the cautious belief that change might finally be possible. When Adrian finished speaking, there was a moment of heavy silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, Louise, the quiet line cook who had stood up to Adrian days before, stepped forward. "We've all made mistakes," he said, his voice firm but kind. "If you're serious about changing, Chef, we'll give you that chance. But it's going to take time. Trust has to be earned." A ripple of agreement swept through the room. Adrian nodded, his shoulders sagging with a mixture of relief and determination. "Thank you," he said softly. "I won't waste this opportunity." The rebuilding begins. Over the next few weeks, the kitchen began to shift in ways both subtle and profound. Adrian, true to his word, made a concerted effort to change his behavior. He started small, listening to his staff's concerns, acknowledging their contributions, and learning to delegate rather than micromanage. It wasn't easy for him. Years of ingrained habits didn't disappear overnight. But each time he slipped, Grace was there to guide him back on course. One afternoon, Grace found Adrian reviewing a menu draft with the sous chefs. Instead of dictating changes, he asked for their input, his tone collaborative rather than commanding. Grace watched from a distance, a small smile tugging at her lips. This was the Adrian she had always believed could emerge, the one buried beneath years of ego and insecurity. The staff, too, began to blossom under the new atmosphere. The once dreaded kitchen became a place of shared creativity and mutual respect. Line cooks who had been timid and withdrawn began to offer suggestions for new dishes. The pastry chef, who had nearly quit after one of Adrian's infamous tirades, presented a bold new dessert idea that Adrian praised enthusiastically. Sarah, the waitress who had been Grace's ally from the start, noticed the change as well. "It feels lighter in here," she said one evening as she helped Grace stack clean plates. "People are smiling again. I never thought I'd see the day." Grace nodded. "It's amazing what can happen when people feel valued." Adrian still has a long way to go, but he's taking the right steps. Marcus returns. Word of the changes at Le Toile d'Or reached Marcus Williams, the restaurant's owner and Grace's son. Though he had entrusted Adrian with the restaurant's operations, Marcus had always kept a close eye on its reputation. The reports of toxicity in the kitchen had troubled him deeply, but he hadn't realized the full extent of the problem until Grace had gone undercover. When Marcus arrived unannounced one afternoon, the staff froze, unsure of what to expect. Adrian, standing at the pass, straightened his posture but didn't flinch. He walked over to Marcus, extending a hand. "Mr. Williams," he said, his voice steady, "thank you for giving me the chance to fix what I broke." Marcus shook his hand, his expression serious but not unkind. "I've heard good things, Adrian, but I want to see for myself." Grace stood nearby, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her son and Adrian exchange respectful nods. The journey had been difficult, but she could see the beginnings of a partnership built on mutual trust. Marcus spent the afternoon observing the kitchen, speaking with staff members, and sampling dishes. By the time dinner service began, he had seen enough. Gathering the staff together, he addressed them with the same warmth and authority that Grace had always admired. "I built Le Toile d'Or with the dream of creating not just exquisite food, but a community," Marcus said. "What I see now is a team that's beginning to rediscover that dream. You've weathered a storm, and you've come out stronger for it. Keep going. Build something you can all be proud of." A kitchen transformed. In the months that followed, Le Toile d'Or underwent a transformation that went beyond its kitchen. Adrian implemented new policies to foster collaboration and reduce burnout, including shorter shifts and opportunities for professional development. He encouraged his staff to experiment with new recipes and techniques, creating a sense of shared ownership over the menu. The change was most visible during service. The once frantic energy of the kitchen had been replaced by a calm, focused rhythm. Orders flowed smoothly, and mistakes were met with constructive feedback rather than rage. Adrian, now a true leader, worked alongside his team rather than above them. Grace continued her work as the restaurant's unofficial mentor, offering quiet guidance and words of encouragement. Though her role as a dishwasher had been a guise, she found immense satisfaction in the connection she had formed with the staff. One evening, after a particularly successful dinner service, Adrian approached Grace as she cleaned up her station. "I owe you more than I can say," he told her, his voice sincere. "You showed me what I couldn't see for myself. You saved this kitchen." Grace smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You saved it, Adrian. I just reminded you of what was worth saving." The new legacy. The turning point for Le Toile d'Or came when the restaurant received a glowing review from a renowned food critic. While the dishes were praised for their creativity and precision, it was the atmosphere in the kitchen that earned the most attention. The true secret ingredient at Le Toile d'Or isn't the food. It's the heart behind it. The review read, "The kitchen is a symphony of teamwork, led by a chef who has rediscovered the soul of his craft." The review cemented the restaurant's reputation as not only a place of culinary excellence, but also a beacon of hope for the industry. Adrian, once known for his tyrannical leadership, became a symbol of redemption and growth. For Grace, the transformation of Le Toile d'Or was more than just a victory. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, compassion, and the belief that change is always possible. As she stood in the kitchen one evening, Watching the staff work together in harmony, Grace felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The legacy of Lee Toildor had been restored, not through fear, but through love and respect. And she knew that her work, though largely unseen, had made all the difference. The transformation of Lee Toildor became a story whispered through the city, a tale of redemption, resilience, and rebirth. Yet as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, it became clear that the real victory wasn't in the accolades or the restored reputation. It was in the people, the team that had once been fractured, now united, and the chef who had reclaimed not just his craft, but his humanity. The final test. As the restaurant prepared for its most prestigious event of the year, a gala to honor culinary excellence in the city, Grace felt a mixture of pride and anticipation. This would be a true test of how far the team had come. The guest list included some of the most influential figures in the culinary world, including critics who had once written scathing reviews about Adrian's tyrannical leadership. The kitchen buzzed with energy, but it was no longer the frenzied chaos it once had been. The staff worked together seamlessly, their movements precise and purposeful. Adrian, now a true leader, moved through the kitchen with quiet confidence, offering guidance and encouragement where needed. As the night unfolded, the dishes that left the pass were nothing short of masterpieces. The flavors, the presentation, the attention to detail, all spoke of a kitchen in perfect harmony. Yet the most remarkable transformation wasn't on the plates, but in the atmosphere. The staff worked with joy, their laughter and camaraderie, infusing the kitchen with an energy that couldn't be manufactured. When the final dish was sent out and the applause from the dining room echoed into the kitchen, Adrian turned to his team. His voice, once sharp and commanding, was now filled with warmth. "This isn't my victory," he said, addressing the staff. "It's ours. Every single one of you played a part in making tonight possible. I'm proud to stand with you." The staff erupted into cheers, their faces glowing with pride. For the first time in years, they felt seen, valued, and part of something greater than themselves. A conversation of closure. As the staff celebrated, Grace slipped away to the dining room, where Marcus stood by the window, watching the city lights. He turned as she approached, a smile spreading across his face. "You did it," Marcus said, his voice tinged with awe. "You really did it." Grace chuckled softly. "I didn't do it alone. Adrian had it in him all along. He just needed a nudge in the right direction." Marcus shook his head. "You're too modest. If it weren't for you, this place would have fallen apart. You saved Lee Toildor, Mom." Grace's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "No, Marcus. This place saved itself. I just reminded everyone. Adrian, the staff, even you, what your father's dream was really about. It was never just about the food or the stars. It was about the people." Marcus nodded, his eyes misty with emotion. "He'd be so proud." "He would," Grace agreed, her voice steady. "But more than that, he'd be proud of you. You trusted me to handle this, and you gave Adrian the chance to redeem himself. That takes courage." The final shift. As the night wound down, Grace returned to the kitchen one last time. She watched the staff clean up, their laughter filling the space that had once been suffocatingly silent. Adrian approached her, his expression one of gratitude and humility. "Grace," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "I can't thank you enough. You changed everything. For me, for the team, for this restaurant. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Grace smiled, her eyes twinkling. "You don't owe me anything, Adrian. Just keep doing what you're doing. Lead with your heart, and this place will thrive." Adrian nodded, his gaze steady. "I will. I promise." As Grace untied her apron for the last time, Sarah approached her with a hesitant smile. "You're really leaving, aren't you?" Sarah asked. Grace nodded. "It's time. My work here is done." Sarah hugged her tightly. "We'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," Grace said, her voice filled with warmth. "But this isn't goodbye. I'll be watching from afar, cheering you all on. A legacy restored. Months later, El Toildor was more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of what could be achieved through resilience, respect, and collaboration. The staff flourished, and Adrian, once feared, became a mentor to the next generation of chefs. The restaurant's reputation soared, not just for its food but for the story behind it. A story of transformation led by an unassuming dishwasher who had been so much more. As for Grace, she moved on to her next challenge, her heart full of pride. She knew that the legacy of El Toildor was secure, built not on fear, but on love and respect. And she knew that wherever she went next, she would carry with her the lessons learned in that extraordinary kitchen, a reminder that true greatness lies not in perfection, but in the people who strive for it together. Grace walked away from El Toildor with her head held high, ready to make a difference wherever the winds of life carried her next. The restaurant's lights shone brightly in the night, a beacon of hope, and she knew her late husband's dream was alive once more.